My name's Andrea. Welcome to the Burn Bag podcast. The Burn Bag was recently asked to help cover the NATO Youth Summit in Miami, Florida, in collaboration with the Aspen Institute. I couldn't go, but I sent two of my co-hosts, Andrea and Christina, there to cover it. I have Andrea joining me right now to sort of share some of her insights, explain some of the interviews, and so on. So, Andrea, first of all, what is the NATO Youth Summit?
Sure. Hi, Andre. So the NATO Youth Summit is a forum in collaboration with Aspen Institute, NATO, and other partners to essentially bring together policy experts, national security experts, and really try and understand how to best get the message across to youth within the alliance, to understand how important NATO is, as well as, what essentially NATO contributes to the security of all of the allied countries within the alliance. So I think, as a baseline, all of us young participants understood what NATO was, of course, but being able to engage with the speakers and the panelists across a variety of different topics, it really honed in on, what are the threats to the alliance today and what is NATO doing to confront that? So it's understanding the future of NATO and our generation's role in keeping the alliance alive. And I think that's something that we're really trying to get the message across throughout the forum, and especially in our one-on-one conversations with speakers.
So what were the types of conversations that you actually had at this event? You interviewed both a lot of the younger participants at this summit, but you also interviewed some senior leaders, including Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell, and some key partners at NATO as well.
Yeah, so our conversations ranged a variety of different topics. We, of course, touched on things that some of the speakers mentioned within their own onstage interviews. So with Deputy Secretary of State, we talked a little bit about Indo-Pacific strategy, how exactly the U.S. is working with NATO allies within that theater. We talked about NATO strategy and multi-domain operations. And, one of the things that I really emphasize within my conversations and something that I was interested in understanding a little bit more coming into the summit was, of course, the collaborative nature of the alliance itself. How do all of our partners, including us, work together to both mitigate and understand the threats that we face today? So, it of course ranged a variety of different topics depending on the areas of expertise that we were covering, but as a whole, I think we really got a good picture of all of the moving parts within the alliance and what exactly, each individual plays within that sphere.
That's super interesting. So you had, as I mentioned, Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell join you. I want to talk about that interview a little bit. A lot's going on in the world, a lot's going on in the State Department. What did Christina and the Deputy Secretary of State talk about?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, Indo-Pacific strategy was really the area of focus for Deputy Secretary of State. During his onstage interview, a lot of the topics focused really on current events and what exactly his area of expertise in the Indo-Pacific, how like that really played into this, security news today. So whether that was understanding, for example, the role that the Indo-Pacific can potentially play or is playing out right now in the war in Ukraine, for example, or different areas, such as how the U.S. is collaborating with NATO allies within the region. So, Christina did a great job of leading that interview, and I think there's so much to be covered in the short amount of time that we had, but really focusing on what Deputy Secretary of State is an expert in.
And I think that's really interesting because often when we think of NATO, we think of NATO in the context of Europe, perhaps as a bulwark to Russia, but we don't necessarily, at least the average listener on this podcast, maybe listeners who aren't necessarily following national security, foreign policy on that day-to-day basis, they don't necessarily conflate NATO and the Indo-Pacific together. So I think for our listeners, you'll find this interview quite interesting, given the Deputy Secretary of State's expertise on the Indo-Pacific, his sort of historical role in shaping Indo-Pacific strategy, and then setting that in the backdrop of, hey, like we're here at this NATO Youth Summit, we're talking about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Atlantic, Pacific, what's that got to do with each other, right? So I mean, maybe I sort of simplified it down a little bit too much, but I do think there are some cool insights in this sort of 10-minute interview. So take a listen.
Hello and welcome back to the Burn Bag. This is Christina and I'm so excited to welcome Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell to the podcast. Deputy Secretary Campbell, thank you so much for being here.
Well, it's my honor. I'm here in Miami to attend the NATO Youth Summit, and it's great to be with you, Christina and Andrea. I appreciate the chance to talk to you and talk to your audience. Thank you.
Thank you again. So just to get right into questions, the United States has in recent years really prioritized the Indo-Pacific as a center of military, strategic, economic, ties. Could you explain to us how the U.S. is reconciling its priorities in the Indo-Pacific with NATO allies who maybe aren't as prioritized in that area of the world?
So let me just say I've been involved in the formulation and execution of sort of national strategy for quite a long time. I think when I was in the Obama administration, we talked about something called the pivot or the rebalance to Asia. I think the recognition was and is today that just dramatic developments on national security, as you describe, innovation, economics, culture, was going to play out increasingly in the Indo-Pacific. And the United States had to position itself more effectively, not only to shape and take advantage of those opportunities, but also to head off outcomes that would be antithetical to our interests. The reason I brought that up, I think at the time that we talked about the pivot, the unfortunate sentiment that emerged during that time was somehow we were pivoting away from Europe. But I think one of the things that we've tried during this period of deep engagement with the Indo-Pacific is actually working with European partners on the Indo-Pacific. And so I think it's much clearer to countries in Europe that our mutual interests are involved in the Indo-Pacific. And so we meet to compare notes, to engage on opportunities commercially, politically, diplomatically. But at the same time, I think, Christine, you're right to point out that there are tensions. I think there are urgent challenges that are present in Ukraine that must be addressed. But at the same time, many of these countries also want to be able to diversify their ties to the Indo-Pacific. And so we're trying to encourage a little of both.
Absolutely. And pivoting to the Youth Summit and the youth here today, how have NATO security priorities changed generationally? And what do you see the main priorities becoming moving forward?
Well, thank you. Look, the NATO was fundamentally, at its founding, a Cold War institution. We're going to be celebrating 75 years in Washington, D.C. in July. And that's going to be an important summit in which we will look back at all the achievements over that time, but also look forward. The original purpose was essentially the creation of a defensive alliance that would band a series of countries together with a collective security architecture, the theory of which that would be enough to resist and deter aggression from the Soviet Union and its so-called Warsaw Pact countries that arrayed against them. I think that mission was accomplished over 40 or 50 years with a degree of success that no one would have anticipated. No shot fired in anger, the Berlin Wall falling, some of the most important members of NATO are now former members of the Warsaw Pact, like Poland more generally. So I think the urgent, immediate task is to deter and defeat Russian aggression in Ukraine. And we have our hands full with that. It's critically important. With the passage of the supplemental 2 weeks ago, I think we're in a better place than we were. And I'm more confident now, but we cannot rest and we cannot ease up. We need to support with new capacities, training, and intelligence, our partners in Ukraine as much as possible. I think going forward, much, Christina, of what the future mission looks like will be affected by what happens on the battlefield in Ukraine. I mean, I think the hope would be not to go back to a divided Europe, but I think what the countries of Western Europe and the other members of NATO have made clear that they're prepared to stand and be vigilant against the kind of revanchist adventurism that Moscow has perpetrated over the course of the last 2 years.
Absolutely. And just on that note, a quick follow-up. As part of the Department of State, one of the top leaders of the Department of State, we see a lot of conflict, obviously, and the outcome of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, being really pivotal to the future of not only NATO, but global politics in general.
Yeah.
But what more can the U.S. and NATO allies be doing diplomatically in order to prevent future conflict besides maybe the Article 5, defense alliance, as well as addition of new members?
So look, first of all, the addition of new members, long-standing nations, Finland and Sweden, deciding to join with NATO, that's a huge vote of confidence and a recognition about how the security issues have changed, and they're even more pronounced than during the Cold War more generally. I think it is fair to say that Europe, NATO, the United States did everything possible in advance of the Ukraine invasion to convince Russia, to convince Putin that such an invasion was not in his interests. We were prepared for a broad, wide-ranging security dialogue, put a lot of things on the table in terms of trying to address Russia's insecurities and anxieties more generally. I think we came to the essential conclusion, though, Christina, that frankly that Putin was determined to invade Ukraine, and there was little that we could do to dissuade him of that more directly. I think the most important thing now is to make clear what the costs are to Russia for any continuing activities. And I think the costs have already been dramatic. Hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded. It has set back the Russian economy, has isolated Putin and Moscow on the global stage. We've seen a greater cooperation between China and Russia, sort of behind the scenes, to help Russia reconstitute its military more directly. But overall, I think the United States and NATO allies have done just about everything possible to send a clear and unambiguous message to Russia.
Thank you. And perhaps on a lighter note, around 200, 300 youth participants here today at the NATO Youth Summit. What has impressed you most about youth participation at the summit?
So first of all, I have young daughters. They're all very politically active. Every morning they give me counsel about how to do a better job. I criticize me. Look, I think it's fantastic to see such a group of people that are committed to America's role on the global stage. That, to me, more than anything else, Christina, is reassuring to see that there are young Americans that do believe that the role and the mission of the United States is important, and that engagement in key institutions like NATO are important for the American role in the world, both today but also in the future.
Absolutely. And this is also a question for me and Andrea, possibly, because I would say we're both youths. But what pieces of
Anyway. Christina, I'd hold on to it as long as you can.
I'm trying to.
Just to say just declare it. I'm a youth.
I'm a youth.
Okay. All right.
But what pieces of advice do you have for young leaders looking to expand their knowledge and experience in diplomacy, foreign affairs?
Oh my goodness. Such a good question. So I will tell you this. Almost every week, I engage with young people, either on my staff or people that I meet, that are so much better trained, so much more capable, so much more dynamic than I was at their age, right? It is daunting to see young people so determined, so passionate about the world. The one thing I will say is I do worry about sometimes, I see this in my daughters, I see this in young people. There is a sense of being in a hurry, that somehow they're getting behind and not able to sort of keep up. I first of all, when I talked to you, I heard about the important work you did on Capitol Hill, working on the Helsinki commissions. I think seeking diverse and interesting experiences, I think doing Burn Bag is great and reach a really wide audience. I'm sure I'll be reading about you soon, you and Andrea, doing new and exciting new things. I think be active, be committed to the public square, be committed to the arena. Don't be afraid, get in the arena. That's my counsel to everyone.
Amazing advice. Anyways, I think we're pretty much out of time, but thank you so much again.
Thank you very much. And you've got to tell young people who are listening that the only thing that you could do that would be disappointing would be to withdraw. Like disinterest, nonchalance, that's not cool. Engage, be passionate.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So, Andrea, I heard y'all also interviewed some key NATO partners, including Vice Admiral Guy Robinson, who I think handles NATO strategy and a lot of that stuff. Can you tell me a little bit more about what Vice Admiral Robinson does?
Sure, Andre. So Vice Admiral Guy Robinson very gratefully, gave us the time to be able to speak with us. He is currently the Chief of Staff of the Supreme Allied Command Transformation at NATO. So for those that don't know in the audience, although everyone is pretty well versed in kind of NATO command structure, NATO operates
versed in NATO command structure. Andrea,
we can take that out.
No, keep it in, but it's just funny.
So the Alliance operates two senior strategic commands, Allied Command Operations and Allied Command Transformation. So one of the ways that we were told to think about this was that the ACO, Allied Command Operations, really focuses on managing all of the operational aspects of NATO military operations, of course. ACT, the Allied Command Transformation, really leads the military adaptation. So it's the brains behind NATO strategy, interoperability, and obviously with the amount of allies that we have within this NATO structure, it's a lot thinking, like a lot of our questions focused on NATO strategic priorities. So in this interview, you'll hear us talk a little bit more about multi-domain operations. So domains, and Andrea, you can elaborate a little bit on this, but where essentially do we operate militarily? Those domains exist in a wide variety of different spaces. And I think a lot of the time, especially in the conversation nowadays, we're hearing cyber, we're hearing space as domains that we're going to really have to enhance our capabilities in operating within. So we talked a little bit about that, synchronizing capabilities and some of the NATO studies that have recently been published, most specifically the 2023 Strategic Foresight Analysis Report. So it was a very brief conversation, although very insightful. I think, Vice Admiral Guy Robinson's perspective on this is very important as we move ahead to thinking about future NATO capabilities, something that was really highlighted in the summit.
So if I'm not one of the many people who understands the NATO command structure and so on, why should I care about this interview, I guess? You mentioned some of these, we're talking about future capabilities. Of course, that involves future warfighting. We're in a very dangerous world these days, and we have many different flashpoints all throughout the world that could incite great power conflict. So I guess, what stood out to you in that conversation with Vice Admiral Robinson that for someone like me who may not necessarily be familiar with all of these sort of operational structures, why should I care?
Sure. I think one of the themes, and especially in the news today, for anyone really tuned into national security, foreign policy, news and insights, really one of the things that we focus on are evolving threats. We just added 2 NATO allied partners. So there, of course, is that aspect of, how do we all collaborate together as the NATO alliance is expanding? So I think for me, one of the things that I really wanted to highlight in this interview and really want to pick, Vice Admiral Guy Robinson's brain about was how are we adapting to the evolving nature of the threats that the alliance is facing over time? So again, like I mentioned, something that we really focused on during the summit was cybersecurity, AI, and that space in itself, personally for me, is something that I don't fully understand. And I also understand the importance of learning more about it and also making an audience, especially, with the NATO Youth Summit targeting towards youth in allied countries, more aware of the importance of this topic and, why we should care. So I think, for someone coming in who maybe doesn't have as much of the insights of like what threats we face today, Vice Admiral Guy Robinson was a great person to speak to in terms of what do we have to look forward to and what is something that our generation eventually will have to face and think about as we move forward and whatever careers we pursue, but obviously, with our audience in mind, focused on national security careers is very pertinent.
We're joined here today by Vice Admiral Guy Robinson, Chief of Staff to Supreme Allied Commander Transformation, or the ACT in short. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks. Yeah, great to be here. Hopefully you can hear me through the background thumb of the music behind us in this NATO Youth Summit.
Yes, I promise we're not at a club right now. The music is just a little bit loud, but okay. So starting off, what are strategic priorities for the Alliance in coming years?
Yeah, well, we're at a pivotal moment in the Alliance, of course, recognized from 2014 when the large reset in NATO after Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. And since then, the Alliance has really been turning back to its core task in deterrence and defense. Some big projects going through since we wrote NATO's military strategy in 2019, and then a reset both in our 2 strategic headquarters, one bringing together new plans to thoroughly defend all of European allies' territory, and then in my headquarters, an opportunity to look to the future through our new warfighting strategic concept, which takes a 20-year view about how NATO needs to adapt.
Mm-hmm. One of the strategic concepts that I did want to focus on a little bit was multi-domain operations. So how are NATO allies synchronizing capabilities to respond to threats across multiple domains?
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that multi-domain operations is the big new approach that the Alliance has taken, alongside many leading allies are also approaching the new paradigm for warfare. But essentially, multi-domain operations is about including the 2 new operational domains within NATO, that's cyberspace and space, and bringing them alongside the traditional operational domains. But it's also about how we're going to collaborate across a number of organizations which we don't command and work very closely with industry who hold many of the capabilities the Alliance might need to use, particularly in space and cyberspace. So it's quite a different approach to how we need to deter and defend going forward.
And just for our listeners, can you elaborate on why multi-domain operations are relevant to evolving global security threats today?
Yeah, well, of course, those 2 new domains, space and cyberspace, present threats to us that are not regional anymore. They're not threats that we're just facing in the European and North American continent, of course. Malign actors, challengers, can influence from any part of the world in those domains. They're critically important for our ability to defend or to deter. And it's really important that we fully understand them and are able to recognize the threats that could emerge anywhere in those 2 new domains.
I did want to touch on the 2023 Strategic Foresight Analysis Report a little bit, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, what were the most insightful findings within this report?
So ACT has reinvigorated its work around strategic foresight most recently. And we published last year, as you point out, our new Strategic Foresight Analysis, which I would point out is not just the great thinkers in ACT, but is a collaboration amongst all allies where we pull together as much foresight work as we can so we can get a collective view about the emerging challenges. One of the starkest, not surprising findings is the challenge of climate change and the catastrophic impacts that will have. Why does that affect that alliance? Well, not least of all, of course, because we're going to have to find new energy sources. We're going to have to fight in increasingly difficult conditions, which will challenge our leaders. But of course, all the consequences from climate change, including migration, population displacement, will also challenge the stability that we're trying to protect in the alliance. So that's one of the biggest findings. There's many insights around new alliances being established around the world, the increasing role of non-state actors and very influential parts of the commercial sector. And I guess the hot topic for many people is how emerging disruptive technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, will play an increasing factor, both in how we deter and defend, and of course how our adversaries might exploit increasingly accessible technologies, which might have only been, the tools of wealthy militaries before, but now in the hands of many other actors.
Yeah, things are ever so changing. So just to wrap us up here, how do these findings, would you say, impact NATO strategic planning and moving forward?
Yeah, well, we're back to our roots, sadly, and it reminds me of when I joined the Alliance 85 years ago. It's not the Cold War again, but the threats to the European continent are very significant. Russia's war in Ukraine has provided a laser focus for the Alliance to reset itself, but we have to make sure that we're taking a 360-degree approach, because whilst there's acute threats within the European domain, of course, there's wider threats in space and cyberspace that challenge the alliance. So we've got to be taking a very broad approach. So not just within alliance members, but of course, building a very strong set of partnerships around the world to ensure we can preserve alliance integrity and keep safe the 1 billion population that we look after within NATO.
Yes, thank you so much, sir, for joining us. Thank you for all your insights, and it's wonderful speaking with you.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So we just heard from Vice Admiral Guy Robinson talking a little bit about NATO strategy. Our second interview was with Colonel Florian Lemoine, scientific advisor to the Allied Command Transformation. A little bit about his role. He really focuses on, how do we keep the alliance to help maintain its competitive edge within emerging technologies. So we talked a little bit about defense innovation. Christina led that interview. She does have some experience in defense innovation, but I know you, Andrea, as well, have worked a little bit in that space, right?
Well, first 2 years of my full-time career have been in that space. So yeah, I find it very interesting. For those in the audience who don't know, defense innovation is certainly on the up and up in terms of how the United States, how our allies in NATO are certainly viewing the future of warfare. We're always trying to come up with, well, not necessarily trying to come up with, but trying to figure out how we can find those resources, get dual-use technologies. Dual-use technologies being technologies that are developed for both commercial use, but can also be used for defensive purposes. Because again, similar to the arms race in the Cold War, we're trying to figure out how we can enhance and expedite our warfighting capabilities in a multitude of ways across many, many different domains. And NATO overall is looking at how it can enhance its own innovation capabilities. One example is Diana Fund. The Diana Fund was started by NATO to essentially accelerate the development of dual-use technologies, get them to the warfighters in general. One thing that many folks know is that the DoD budget is massive. One of the reasons it's pretty big is because of all these processes. When you sort of identify a problem, and then you identify a solution, oftentimes it can take months to even years to actually get that solution to the war fighter. So how do we actually make that process quicker? How do we make it faster, more efficient, cheaper, which I, as a taxpayer, would love for it to be cheaper. So I think this conversation is super interesting, particularly with the war in Ukraine. We're seeing very novel uses of different capabilities, different types of technologies. And of course, many folks are writing about maybe conducting even war games around how are these technologies going to be employed if great power conflict occurs. So this conversation will be super interesting. So without further ado, here's the Colonel.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm Florian. My background is aerospace engineering, capability development, and innovation. I have been working in ACT in Norfolk, so the NATO home in USA, for 6 years now, and currently I serve as the scientific/digital advisor to General Levin, in charge of transformation of NATO.
So, Colonel Florian Lemoine, could you talk to me a bit about what the ACT Allied Commander Transformation's mission or goal really is?
So, ACT, these days, one of our main mission in transforming the military instrument of power of NATO is to move it towards what we call multi-domain operations. So multi-domain operations, say it simply, there is an inner aspect to it. So from a warfare perspective, it's really to transform the way we do operations. Today, we do joint, so we coordinate the various domains together. We really must integrate these domains for them to act as one, faster, better, from our perspective. But multi-domain goes beyond the military instrument of power. It's also about synchronizing this military instrument with other instruments of power, diplomatic, economics, technological, so inner circle and outer circle. And this overall purpose drives most of our lines of efforts today.
Perfect. And we're just going to start talking about the NATO Innovation Hub. How do you enable the alliance to keep its competitive edge within the emerging technology space?
Thanks. So that's a very good question. So as Secretary General mentioned this morning, technological edge has been key to NATO success for 75 years until now. And our mission is to make sure, part of our mission is to make sure we keep this edge. So innovation is key in that endeavor. I would say in NATO, innovation is divided in two main swim lanes. One is the directed innovation, which is more traditional and has been going on forever, basically, in NATO. So it's when governments pay for the S&T. So on that hand, we work a lot with academia, with research labs. There is a huge network in NATO called the Sciences and Technological Organization, STO, and they are our prime partner. And on directed innovation, the way to work at the alliance level is basically to connect the national resources and teams and labs together on topics of common interest. Because through diversity, through collaboration in this field, we can multiply the effects. So it's more on lower tiers, and then it goes to industry and capability development. But the most fascinating part these days is the other swim lane, the open innovation. So open innovation, it's the opposite. The idea is now tech is driven by commercial sector, mainly from a budget perspective in particular. So our mission now is to become fast followers on this tech, AI, cloud, quantum, biotech, a lot of things now are accelerating a lot. Yeah. How do you become fast follower? ACT Innovation was created in 2012, so more than 10 years ago. And the idea at the time was to test what is open innovation, which is about identifying opportunities in the commercial tech, testing at small scale in the defense environment, through experimentation, through gaming, through whatever. And if there is real defense value into it, then finding the best way to scale it up. So this DNA, it was not created by NATO. We just adopted this open innovation logic. And since 2012, what is amazing is that in NATO, we have contributed a lot to spreading this open innovation idea. Now in NATO, you have more than 20 open innovation entities in all our nations. And they are working together. The last piece is Diana, so this Defense Innovation Accelerator. So we conceptualized what Diana is today a few years ago. And now it's a new player in this ecosystem, able to develop even more the connections between all our innovation, entrepreneurs, industries.
Can you maybe outline the strategic context as to why emerging technologies are important for enhancing NATO capabilities? You mentioned NATO Diana. I know a couple companies that have started contracts with NATO Diana.
Yeah, so why is it so essential? So back to what I said earlier, it's about the technological edge, but it goes beyond technology. For defense, we need to work on what warfare means and how we conduct operations, basically. And the very central characteristics of warfare is always the same. It's about understanding the situation, deciding, acting, and again, at all levels, in all domains. The key is to make sure that you understand better and you decide faster and you act stronger than your opponents. And here, if you look into what data tech some years ago, into what AI can do today, into what quantum will bring to us, it's tremendous in terms of acceleration, in terms of understanding better a situation, a highly complex situation, in terms of deciding much faster, using AI assistants, for example, in terms of coordinating better the actions in all the domains to make sure when we do something, it's more powerful than the opponent. So this is why tech is so essential to warfare today and more essential than ever.
And you talk about warfare, and a really prominent war going on right now is the war in Ukraine, Russia's attack on Ukraine. How do we see these emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, playing out on the battleground in Ukraine?
When you observe Ukraine, there are a lot of lessons learned to be done from this. What is happening from this horrible war there? What is clear to a lot of observers is that Ukrainians have mastered the art of leveraging technology to increase their defense, to multiply their defense capabilities. And it's amazing to observe how leveraging smartly AI, for example, you can circumvent, for example, jamming in the field, GPS jamming, which used to be a big issue some months ago. Now you can observe a lot of new solutions based on AI. It's a game changer, and it's only one example among many. But the key is not only the tech, it's also the way you leverage the tech and the speed at which you are able to leverage it.
So Ukraine's been doing a good job adopting this technology at speed.
Yes, they are a very interesting example, a very smart example of collaboration between defense and tech and industry and academia stakeholders together to transform what needs to be transformed.
And all these things you named, academia, defense companies, think tanks, commercial companies, what is NATO currently doing to support and foster innovative partnerships with these non-traditional stakeholders? So
this is on this open innovation, and I was mentioning earlier, making sure we connect as many diverse stakeholders as possible is key. A key asset of NATO is diversity in terms of nations, cultures, but also diversity in terms of industries, in terms of S&T stakeholders. So it has been recognized in ACT and in NATO in general as a key axis to transform our alliance. And this is something you can also observe now in more and more national defense strategies. We often nickname it next-gen industry, defense and tech industry. So the core idea is to find ways to mix the DNA of more traditional defense industry and tech industry, commercial tech industry together, because together they can provide much more added value than alone. So that's what we do, and in the end, it's about connecting these communities together with the warfighters, with the military, and enabling experimentation, enabling testing together to open new ways of doing things. And then, once you have identified something which is valuable at small scale, to find ways to scale it up into our capabilities and concepts.
And just to wrap up, one last question. We've covered everything that I wanted to cover, but what do you think your greatest accomplishment has been during your time at NATO, or like what the ACT's greatest accomplishment has been?
Yeah, so I think there are many great accomplishments over the past years in ACT. To quote a few, the creation of Diana was a real success some years ago, and it came from ACT conceptual work, and now it's here and it's accelerating dual-use technologies. The NATO digital transformation also was born not only, but for a good part in ACT, and now we see all the NATO nations moving to that direction together, and we know this is a game changer for our defense. So these two are probably major successes from ACT.
Thank you so much again, Florian, for joining us.
So we just finished hearing from Colonel Florian Lemoine, and the final interview that we have with experts throughout the forum is with Lauren Walsh, who is the director of the Gallatin Photojournalism Intensive. So she was able to sit down and speak with us a little bit ad hoc as I was really picking her brain on her career and her work, especially helping support photojournalists. And one of those things, especially, talking a little bit more about conflict and security, which is an area that she has worked across throughout her photojournalism career. We talked a little bit about the strategies that photojournalists use, specifically in the storytelling realm. So one of the things that I was really interested in, Andrea, was, how does the photojournalist come in and tell the story, particularly from their perspective of coming in, usually as a Westerner, telling the story of those who are subjects or victims of conflict. We talked a little bit more about risk assessment, which I think is something that also for me, trying to understand, the bravery and I guess the risks, of course, that these people take when they go into hostile areas, and the importance of telling this story to different audiences, of course. So our conversation kind of flowed and ranged from a variety of different topics, but I, as someone who maybe is not really slated for pursuing a photojournalism career, but is so has read Lindsay Adario's book, Clarissa Ward's book, really fascinated with the career itself. It was kind of an eye-opening conversation, and I know that her speech at the forum was really popular with the audience and really engaging. So this conversation was pretty interesting.
And when you mention war photography, I'm thinking about that movie I saw recently, Civil War, starring Kirsten Dunst. Super fascinating movie. Also provides a great commentary on the idea of war photography. Oftentimes, as Andrea, you said, you have Western war photographers going into countries where they're not from, or maybe they don't necessarily have the most familiarity with those cultures, the people, and so on. And I thought the movie Civil War actually sort of portrayed that in a very interesting way, because it portrayed how is war photography, how would that handle, say, a hypothetical American Civil War. And I suggest you all sort of go and see that movie. It's a very fascinating movie, but that just reminded me a little bit of your conversation with Lauren, because, not necessarily that the conversation itself did, but that topic feels very relevant today, especially as we're seeing a lot of the images coming out of Gaza, especially as we've seen images come out of Ukraine, and oftentimes with a lot of conflicts that Americans necessarily aren't really familiar with. Perhaps it's just a few images that may define those conflicts. Think about the Vietnam War. There are a couple of strong images that very much are in the American psyche when we think about photography. So, and those are produced by war photographers.
Right, exactly. I've also heard of the Civil War movie. It's on my list to watch. I need to make it out to the movies more. But I've also heard critiques that it necessarily isn't the most accurate representation of the work that photojournalists do, especially in hostile areas. And this again points to, what I said earlier about storytelling. I think, the relationship that an outsider is able to build with their subject, who is ultimately telling the story that they want to tell, is the crux of being able to get whatever message you want to get across. And I like how you also spoke a little bit about, the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, and storytelling and news in that aspect. One of the things that Lauren and I touched on was just amateur photojournalism, in the sense that in some of the conflicts, sometimes it's hard to get formal photojournalists out in the field, and people on the ground really have to rely on informal ways of telling that story, whether that's through Telegram channels or social media. So obviously, the nature of storytelling and news has changed, especially in the course of these wars, but excited for you all to take a listen.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Bird Guide podcast. So I'm here with Lauren. Lauren, can you just introduce yourself a little bit and tell us about the work that you do?
My name is Lauren Walsh. I'm a professor at NYU, where I run the Gallatin Photojournalism program. I'm a specialist in photojournalistic coverage of conflict and crisis, an author who publishes on this, and I work with photojournalists globally in what we call hostile environments.
Mm-hmm. So hostile environments, typically war zones, or where have you gone?
It's hostile environments definitely includes war zones, but it's also any spaces where risks can be high. So it can also just be like natural disasters or spaces of kind of really serious social upheaval. I don't tend to go to front lines, but I am usually communicating with people who are in the frontline spaces.
Mm-hmm. A little bit in your presentation recently here up on stage, I was able to catch glimpses of it here in the back room. You kind of don't get that much audio. That's really good. But you were talking a little bit about photo composition and how that works. And I was really interested in the strategy that photojournalists take in telling that story. How can you make a photo tell a story in the way that you want it to?
Sometimes it's luck. So I think it depends on the circumstances, right? Like if you're in a very volatile, very quickly unfolding situation, it can be harder to be a bit more purposeful about the composition. Even so, photojournalists who have a lot of experience are able to, by and large, stay calm in these situations and safely get pictures. If you're in a place where things are less of the moment volatile, then yeah, you can definitely think through the scene and take your time. And by the time a photojournalist is a working professional, they are completely unconscious to the fact that they are always actually thinking about light and light sources, and they're kind of seeing compositions whenever they move around. So it becomes a little bit of second nature to try to get an image that should be strong. And then on top of that, what the photojournalist has to do is be thinking is this newsworthy? Is this showing the story? Is this a fair representation of what's going on? Is this going to work well, with a media outlet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thinking a little bit more about that fair representation aspect that you touched on. I guess, what is the struggle that photojournalists have, especially us potentially coming, from the US and other Western countries and going to hostile areas? I guess, confronting the challenges of being able to relate to the topics and the subjects within these photos. How do photojournalists kind of navigate that complex gray area in terms of how do I tell the story correctly? And am I someone who can relate exactly to what, individuals or what I'm photographing is going through?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I would say that good photojournalists should be doing their homework, and maybe you get an assignment and you only have a day or two before you have to get on a plane. You should be using that day or two to prepare and research, but also you should be fluent in what's going on in the news story that you're going to be sent to cover. Historically, it was more often the case to have American and European photojournalists, and the phrase was always parachute in, right? Mm-hmm. So we'd parachute you in, then we get you out. In the recent past, there has been a lot of pushback on that for kind of what your question is getting at. Do you really know the landscape? Are you really thinking of the people? And I think there are photojournalists who have done good work and they do know the landscape and they are thinking of the people. But at the same time, what about a diversity of voices in photojournalism and working with local photographers? So even I tend to work with a lot of local photographers globally. And one of the images that I showed was from Ukraine by a Ukrainian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great perspective. And I've always thought about like the storytelling aspect too. It's always interesting and challenging for people that are working within this photojournalism area as well. So thinking a little bit more, I guess one of the topics that I did want to discuss with you was censorship in photojournalism, and especially with like recent conflicts, both in Ukraine and in particular Israel Hamas. What challenges are photojournalists facing in terms of censorship, and what exactly maybe governments or conflicting forces want the message?
So there's a variety of ways to think about censorship, and some of them will be like really just in your face censorship. And I'll give you an example of that. I did a book that came out after my conflict book, and it was a book about Black Lives Matter and the pandemic. It's like these two things collide at once. Yeah. And I was working with a photojournalist in China who was in Wuhan, which was the outbreak of, and he described a story of going into a COVID center and with the permission of the doctors, and he was with a colleague, a videographer, and the two of them were there documenting, and law enforcement showed up and forced them to delete their work, like just completely forced them to essentially reformat their SD cards. Yeah. So that to me is like a very serious, a very in-your-face censorship. Like you had permission, you just created images, and we're going to make you destroy it. Mm-hmm. There's other ways I think that censorship can operate. Sometimes it's just a lack of access. Like I can't get to this. So it's not necessarily an outright censorship, but you still can't get to the thing you need to document. Mm-hmm. In terms of the Israel-Hamas war, I think there's two ways to think about it. One, no one can get in or out of Gaza. So the only documentarians are Palestinian, which puts a huge burden on these journalists who are also in the midst of a horrific onslaught. So they're dealing with the deaths of their families and their friends, and they're working as journalists at the same time. And I believe, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, more journalists have died in Gaza than in any other space since Committee to Protect Journalists was established, right? So the death toll for journalists is super, super high. Yeah. So the fact that outside journalists can't go in to also be contributing to the documentation has been very hard on a local Palestinian media ecosystem. There have been a few cases where the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, will allow outside media to go in essentially on a choreographed tour with the IDF. And so you get into Gaza and you're there for like 4 hours, but you're there under the direction of the IDF, who decides where you go and what you see. And so again, it's a weird gray zone, right? Like they're giving some access, but it's a very, very limited and largely scripted access to what is going on.
Yeah. Do like these actors, I guess, still like prior to publishing or something, like is there a way essentially that the photojournalist can go in under these auspices, like, oh yes, you're being supervised in terms of what you're photographing and whatnot, but maybe you take pictures in an angle that you want to and be able to frame that in a different perspective? Or do they also essentially control what you're able to publish and write post visit?
It's going to depend on each embed situation, and you usually have to sign a contract, and a contract will tell you if there needs to be a review of your images or not. I haven't heard of situations where it's at the level of controlling like this angle versus that angle. It's more like we'll take you into this area and you can see what's happening here. And then, whether or not your imagery or your work has to go through a review is case by case dependent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I'm just thinking about your comment also, as well as, ordinary civilians serving as photojournalists during this time. Do you think there's a certain power to that? Perhaps like if someone publishing photos on social media versus, a person who pertains to like a specific organization. Is there maybe, does the message resonate a little bit more with the public, would you say?
I mean, I think like on the one hand, I am someone who believes like good, legitimate journalism is really important because if it's done right, it is held to a certain standard that we know that we should be like, okay, there is integrity here and I can trust this. On the other hand, I mean, in the case of Gaza, like there is a fair bit of citizen journalism happening, and there's no filter, right? Like, it's really graphic if you're encountering this on social media. And for some people, I think that might be extremely distressing and upsetting, if not even revolting. But I do think it has had some impact in terms of just pushing a public outcry.
Yeah, definitely. I know, I'm just thinking of like Telegram, for example. It's something that I sometimes go on, and you see probably the worst on there.
You definitely see worse than what's going to get published on the front page.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. But, also like witnessing people's reactions to that is something that's so visceral. Okay, so one of the last questions that I did want to ask, just because, I don't know, photojournalism, especially in hostile areas, really interests me. What is like the risk management process for journalists working in this space? Like, how do you guys think of risk?
I love this question because I work as a safety and security advisor, so it's very important. So traditionally, going back over the years, journalists were pretty much thinking in terms of physical risk. Like, I'm going to a war zone, I need a flak jacket with a certain, ballistic grade plate in it, I need a helmet, maybe I need goggles. So they're thinking in terms of that. I have a number of colleagues who've been advocating for bringing a kind of safety awareness into journalism schools. And what some of us are trying to teach is, it's called a risk assessment, and you're supposed to do the risk assessment before you go on any assignment. And some assignments will be simple if you're not going to a war zone, and some assignments will be very complicated. And essentially, it's kind of thinking about, what are your physical risks? What are your emotional risks? What are your legal risks? What are your digital risks? And then from there, kind of breaking each of those categories down. So like, who are you going with? Who might you encounter? What are the cultural nuances? What do you need to prepare? What's your backup if this happens? Who do you call? Who needs to check on you if they haven't heard from you in 12 hours? Right? Like, it can span, it can be a one-page risk assessment, and I've seen 50-page risk assessments.
Wow.
So,
yeah, what do you mean by digital risk?
Depending on where you are going, if generally it's a government, if they are aware that you are a journalist and they are not very kind to journalists, you have to be careful that you, aren't tracked, because like our phones are constantly giving off signals, right? And then you can be tracked and harmed. And that has happened with photojournalists in the past. Or if if a government wants to keep tabs on what you're doing and they infect your phone with Pegasus or other spyware, that's also a big problem. So those are some of the digital risks. At a more basic level, what I have seen happen, and so this is kind of a starting point for people going into particular kinds of hostile environments, is removing lots of identifying information from your phone, including sources you might be working with, because if you're kidnapped and you are forced to open your phone, not only are you at risk, but you've now put your family or your sources at risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow, and a lot to consider. I mean, I was thinking of detentions, now I'm thinking of kidnapping.
It's all good when you talk to me.
Yeah, I know. Very exciting work. Well, thank you so much, Lauren, for taking the time to be with us. Keep doing what you're doing. It's very cool.
And that was Lauren Walsh. My name's Andrea. We'd like to thank everyone at Aspen for helping to coordinate this, for having Andrea and Christina at the summit, at the event. We'd like to also thank all the guests who took their time to participate in these interviews with Andrea and Christina. We'll have a forthcoming episode in a couple of days featuring some insights from some of the youth delegates at the NATO Youth Summit. But for now, this is the Burn Bag. Thank you.